So here's our introduction for our speaker today. His name is Dr. Fred Johnson III, and he is our Guy Vanderjack Endowed Professor of History. And that Guy Vanderjack was a graduate of Hope in 1953. Many of you remember him. And Fred has been on the faculty since 2000. Whoa.
Yeah,
That's getting close to a quarter of a century.
I know.
Yeah.
I can feel it sometimes. Yeah.
Gosh. You could keep going, you know.
Yeah.
He has a BA from Bowie State University and an MA and PhDs from Kent State. And prior to his career in higher education, he served in the U.S. Marine Corps, and his primary field of study is 19th century U.S. history, specifically the Civil War. Other areas of expertise are 20th century U.S. history, U.S. military history, and African history. I think I misspoke. I said world discussion. It's world decisions is what we're talking about today. And our topic is future of NATO. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 22, think how long ago that is, the NATO organization has come under increased scrutiny, and not because the NATO troops are involved in the conflict, but because of the critical role in relations between Russia and its neighbors. What lies ahead for NATO? Will expanding its membership serve to protect new and existing members, or will that provoke Russia even further? Or maybe both? And you're the man to tell us. Thank you. Please welcome our guest today, Dr. Fred Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Kit, for that great introduction as usual. Well, a lot has happened since you and I last saw each other. And we're talking about the future of NATO, and what has been happening will surely have a not oblique, but a direct impact on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to include its very existential survival. I thought I'd start off like this. You know, at the front of the National Archives building, I spent a lot of time going down there as an undergrad and while attending Bowie State College. There's always a fun thing to take the subway downtown, come out from under the tunnel, and to walk to the National Archives and see this in front of the building. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. I would always go there and stand there and look at that thing for several minutes, just contemplating what did that mean. It meant something before I went to OCS, Officer Candidate School at Quantico. It meant something different, similar but different, on the eve of my commissioning into the Marine Corps. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. I remember being at Quantico Town on base one day during Weekend Liberty, walking downtown in Q-Town, and saw a sign in the window that said, "In times of peace, prepare for war." So I thought about that. And then this one, eternal vigilance. And I asked myself, what do they mean eternally vigilant? What does eternal vigilance mean? It means that when it comes to democracy, liberty, and freedom, there's no such thing as a day off, a moment off, a week off. That is, every waking moment of every day of our lives must be eternally vigilant, because there are those out there who are being just as vigilant about trying to make sure that their liberty is taken away from you. There are things that they're called clear and present dangers, not to be underestimated, not to be trifled with, not to be given an inch, because they're prepared to take an L. And so, can we be eternally vigilant, given all that's gone on the last 2 years, and like Kit pointed out, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine? As you know, that on November 5th, 2024, we had an election. On November 5th, 2024, we understood things to be one way. 24 hours later, things were another way. There were those who won, and those who saw it as the beginning of the apocalypse. People feel as they feel. I'm told that we are a 50-50 nation or a 49-51 nation. Maybe we are, I don't know. But by November 6, 2024, the future for the next 4 years was at least set. That's the way America's done things. I just want to throw something out to you all. Just consider this. I don't need you to answer this. But just reflect on this for a moment. Today is the 20th. So it's been 15 days. Can you recall one time in the last 15 days, have you heard anything about rigged elections? Have you heard anything about voter fraud? Have you heard anything about broken electoral systems? Anything? Could it be that all of a sudden they were automatically fixed because a certain result came out? I'm just asking questions here. And if you haven't heard about none of that stuff, here's the question: why? And even more than that, against the backdrop of that, you understand that collectively, as a body politic, the entire nation, that means that if you've heard nothing for the last 15 days, but that also means that for the last 3 years, we have been beaten and harassed and harangued and beat up and traumatized with nothing but all kind of allegations about what? Voter fraud, rigging, and broken electoral systems. And all of a sudden got fixed. If they're that broken, that corrupt, that inept, how did they suddenly get that fixed? I'm just asking questions. So given the results, people had and have questions about the United States. People have and had questions about democracy. And people have those kind of questions about every electoral result. And as a result of the United States democracy, American Republican democracy, American constitutionally established Republican democracy, people understandably have questions about our alliances, our place in the world, our leadership in the world, and that means NATO. Questions about the North Atlantic Alliance, which has lasted since 1949. I think sometimes we tend to forget that America is a superpower. It's not a late 19th century winner of the Spanish-American War as an emerging power, not even a great power post-World War I. We are a superpower with super influence. That means both materially, politically, economically, and culturally. What we say matters to people. I just kept telling a student of mine, an officer candidate, who'll be getting commissioned in the spring. I said, people have said that to me in Casablanca, Morocco, in Nairobi, Kenya, in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in Yaoundé, Cameroon, in Berlin, in Toronto, in Ottawa. Around the world, people have told me about how important the United States is to them. In London, what we do matters. We leave a big footprint wherever we go. And so as a superpower, it's just my estimation, my opinion, as a superpower that's competing with other powers like Russia and China, then we have a responsibility as a superpower. And given an option of having people following Russia and China or us, I vote us. But I thought it might help our discussion to at least address briefly why NATO came into existence in the first place. So come with me back in time to 1945, to the Elbe, when American and Soviet forces linked up.
The link up between the Americans and the Russians at the River Elbe near Torgau marked the climax of the two great advances into the heart of Germany from west and east. It was colossal news, announced on the eve of the enemy's total collapse. And this is how Major General Reinhardt and his staff crossed the river. Somebody called it the Elbe Regatta. On the other bank, a more imposing link-up was effected. The first had been a matter of recce patrols meeting, but now there were generals and flags, with the Union Jack also in the picture, as it most certainly deserved to be.
Okay, you get the picture. Just as a little footnote, I really wish they had not been playing, or I wish I was in the land of cotton. Come on, y'all. Peace and brotherhood, right? So there was that moment of really great, I mean, it must have been a fantastic moment when Soviet and American forces met at the Elbe in 1945. I mean, consider all that we had been through in World War II. I'm telling you, this history, we've got to do a better job of communicating it to ourselves and especially to young people, because I had a student say to me yesterday, I mentioned John McCain and they went, "Who's that?" I went, no, seriously. If we can't remember who John McCain was, we've got a problem. You cannot forget the son and grandson of an admiral that did his duty, that spent 7 or 8 years in the Hanoi Hilton, sacrificing for his country, has been defamed and all kind of besmirching. John McCain needs to be remembered, not reclaimed, not rehabilitated. He needs no rehabilitation. We can't forget people like John McCain. That's problematic. But just as quickly as that meeting happened on the Elbe, distrust, fear, suspicion, as the dust was literally settling and the smoke clearing from World War II, when it all began to break down. And what was called the Grand Alliance of the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain collapsed into something called the Cold War that lasted from 1946 to 1991. On February 9th, 1946, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, the premier of the Soviet Union, went before a body called the Bolshoi Theater, and gave what was known as his Bolshoi speech, where he essentially blamed the West for all the misery and suffering and the trauma that the Russian people had suffered. He wasn't wrong. The fact that Stalin was a brutal dictator and a communist, he was occasionally right on some things. So technically he was right. The Russian people at the hands of the Nazis, the Germans that is, a Western nation, technically, geographically, he was right that Russia had suffered tremendously under Western attack. The Nazis, the fact that they were the Nazis is kind of like, secondary to the fact that it was a Western nation. And the Russians have been invaded not once, but twice within a generation, World War I and then World War II. They say that during World War II, that World War II was won by Russian blood, British ingenuity, and American money. We need to remember that on June 22nd, 1941, the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe crossed the Soviet frontier, invading Russia. And from 1941 to 1943 at Stalingrad, the Russian people were subjected to some of the most horrific warfare, if you can call it that. I'm still trying to determine what they went through as warfare. I know it happened during war. I'm not so sure that it was warfare as in tactical operations, because into Russia were unleashed the Einsatzgruppen, the killing squads whose only designation was to kill men, women, and children. So if you are a Russian, you are already called Untermensch, subhuman by the Nazis. If you are a Russian, so they hate Slavs. They hate communists. And if you're a Russian Jew who's a communist, they're going to kill you 3 times. So the Russian people did suffer tremendously. Babi Yar, the siege of Leningrad, hostiles fighting at Stalingrad. It was epic, to say the least. So Stalin blames the West. And in a generic sense, he's not right. But more than blaming the West, he says, and we're not going to let this happen again. He goes back to 1918 when the British and the Americans, who were worried about the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, deployed there with troops to stop what quickly turned into the Russian Civil War. Yeah, we did invade them. So he wasn't wrong about being invaded from the West by the Americans and the British. At the time, the bromance between America and England wasn't what it is today. They still didn't trust each other very much. So the command structure between the two opposing forces broke down and they had to withdraw. In Russia at the time, there was a brilliant American diplomat, probably one of the most important ones of the 20th century, George Frost Kennan. George Kennan found out about what Stalin said at the Bolshoi speech and wrote a very long telegram. Some people say it was 5,000 words. Some people say 7,000 words. Some people say 10,000 words. I can just tell you whatever it was too long to be written without a word processor. He wrote this long telegram, sent it back to his bosses in Washington, D.C., warning about what Stalin had said, saying that they had become very aggressive and that they were looking to expand their influence in Eastern Europe where they already were and possibly around the globe. So Kennan came out and essentially what he recommended was containment of the Soviet Union. That is wherever they go, the Americans and their Western allies meet them toe-to-toe, not invading them, because Americans after World War II are not in the mood for another world war, not so soon. And you're not going to push the Russians back. Mr. Neff, my ninth grade history teacher, said to put it like this: that wherever the Red Army went in World War II, from Moscow to the east, there they stayed when the war ended. American forces stood down and came home. Could not wait to get back to normal, whatever that was. We're going to move on past Kennan because I want to have some discussion on this. On March 5th, so that's February 1946, when Stalin gives his speech. On March 5th, 1946, the month after, Winston Churchill came to Fulton, Missouri to give a speech. And at this speech, he gave a grave prediction about the way things were developing in Europe.
In the spring of 1946, Winston Churchill traveled to the United States. He tried to shock Americans out of their complacency. In a speech at Fulton, Missouri, carried on radio, he warned them how the Soviets were acting in Europe.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Budapest. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere.
Churchill's vivid picture of a continent divided by an iron curtain helped change the public mood. Once the press had portrayed
The Iron Curtain across Europe, primarily on the eastern side of that wall, all those nations that became part of what was known as the Soviet East Bloc, the future Warsaw Pact, as an offset to NATO. Czechoslovakia, which was a creation after World War I, merging the Czech and Slovak republics into Czechoslovakia. Romania, Hungary, which used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that even after World War I and after World War II into the 1990s, still had the same problem that to precipitate World War I, which was squabbling ethnicities wanting autonomy. That problem has not been resolved today. East Germany, dominated by the Russians, who have taken the SS, the Schutzstaffel, or should I say the Gestapo, the remnants of that, and woven into a new thing called the Stasi, the new secret police. So tyranny is once again asserting itself in Europe. And keep in mind, for the generation of World War II, they have not even had time yet to get past the old tyrannies of Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and militarist Japan. So this is a lot for humanity to pivot on a dime like that, but they got to do it. And then, as 1946 turned into 1947, trouble arose in Mediterranean Europe, particularly in Greece. It turns out that while the Nazis occupied Greece during World War II, similar to the Japanese had occupied China during World War II, and there still was a civil war going on between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. Likewise, in Greece, a civil war that was going on between different factions, some communist-backed, some Republican-backed, or call themselves Republican, was going on under Nazi occupation, with some collaboration from other nations inside of Eastern Europe. I've looked at a map of occupied Europe from World War II, and there are nations that were opposed to each other that were collaborating with the Nazis. And I ask myself each time, who are these people that collaborate with these guys? Who calls the Nazis friends and say, oh yeah, I like your program? But people did. That's what we need to know. So during their occupation by the Nazis, you would think to yourself, what could be worse than being occupied by the Nazis? Well, apparently it didn't get bad enough for them to suspend fighting with each other. And so they did. And their fighting carried past the war into the early post-time or post-war world.
Hello and welcome to History Pod. On the 12th of March 1947, US President Harry S. Truman called for economic and military aid to Greece and Turkey in what became known as the Truman Doctrine. The aftermath of the Second World War saw Greece rocked by civil war between the royal government and the leftist National Liberation Front, who were supported by neighbouring communist Yugoslavia. Meanwhile, in Turkey, the government there had been under pressure from the USSR over access to the strategic waterways that linked the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. In an attempt to limit communist expansion into Europe, the British government provided economic and military assistance to both the Greek and Turkish governments. However, in February 1947, Britain informed the US government that it couldn't afford to continue this support while they faced their own economic crisis at home, and that they would stop providing aid on the 31st of March. In what later became known as the domino theory, Truman's advisors explained that if either Greece or Turkey fell to communism, then it could spread to the rest of Europe and Asia. To avoid this, they urged policymakers to take Britain's place and provide support to the two governments. On the 12th of March, President Truman appeared before a joint session of Congress where he laid out the threat. Among other things, he stated, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." In a program that won broad support, America committed to providing $400 million in assistance to Greece and Turkey.
Okay, so the Greeks are faced with a communist insurgency trying to overthrow the royal government. But we got to expand the lens on this a little bit to take it back to World War I, because you can't understand what's going on in 1947 with the Greeks and the British without taking into account both World Wars I and World War II. World War I, France and Great Britain are dominant colonial powers in the Mediterranean, in Africa, and in Asia. Well, colonialism, which is a modified form of slavery, domination, and the people in Africa and Asia did not like it, obviously, and fought. Let me just use Vietnam as an example. They had tried to be dominated by the Chinese, kicked them out several times. They fought against the French, kicked them out. Japanese came, kicked them out. French came back, kicked them out again. They'll eventually kick us out when we get there. And the central message is this: it's not who you are. We don't want anybody dominating us. That's the central message. It's not your identity, what country you come from. We want to be independent people. Was Ho Chi Minh a communist? Yes, he was. Never denied that. He was more a nationalist than he was a communist, though, or at least as much of a nationalist as he was a communist. So with Great Britain unable to hang on to its territories, its colonies in Africa and Europe after World Wars I and II. World War I, we lost 11 million people in Europe. World War II, 50 million people in Europe. Just the European theater alone, that does not include the Pacific theater. You cannot hold on to colonies as an island nation when you have bloodletted your economy, your blood and treasure, and within a generation, you can't do it because people who are colonized want to be independent and free. To hold them in subjection requires military might and money, and they didn't have any more. So they had to leave Greece. When they left Greece, they let it be known there's a communist insurgency. America, here you go. Truman stepped up as the leader of a new superpower that it flexed its atomic might on August 6th and 9th at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the time, we were the only nation on earth that holds, as one of my students put it, world-ending weapons. And the Truman Doctrine essentially came down to this: the United States will provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under threat from external or internal authoritarian forces. And my first reaction to that is yes. My next reaction is, what does that mean? The United States will provide political, military, and economic assistance. Well, what kind of military, political, economic assistance? When? How long? Under what conditions? Is there an end date? None of those questions are answered. It's an open-ended proposal for a brand new situation called the Cold War. To all democratic nations under threat. Well, what do we mean democratic? Like democratic as in our form, or what they call it? Like democracy, or democracy as in Guatemala when they overthrow our Benz, or Patrice Lumumba, who's the first democratically elected leader in the Congo, who's assassinated, replaced by Mobutu Sese Seko. So what are we talking about? It takes American foreign policy and sends it into a brand new direction, because we understand that in 1941, when you attack Pearl Harbor, the American president Franklin Delano Roosevelt has to respond with a declaration of war, or else he's out of a job. So we understood American foreign policy since 1775 had been of the kind that you hit us, we hit you back. This is something different. We've not been hit directly. So what is this foreign policy doing to us? How is it reshaping our understanding of America's role in the world and what our responsibilities are as a global superpower? Then in 1948, not so much on the world stage, but because communism is what it was, or was what it was, inside the United States, there was always something going on that had been happening since 1938 under the House Un-American Activities Committee. Born in 1938 in response to communist activity because of, among other things, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And then in 1917, you're aware of the fact, doing the chronology here, 1917, Bolshevik Revolution, the Russians in 1918 signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, taking them out of World War I, which angers the West, including the United States, because as far as Lenin is concerned, this is a capitalist war, destroy yourselves. They pulled back, which means that in World War I, this means that the Germans now have brand fresh new troops on the Eastern Front they can send to the West, prolonging the war. So Russia instantly gets the reputation for being unreliable under the communists, and they were unreliable under the communists. But Lenin says, I'm going to pull back in, consolidate power under a communist government. They'll fight this civil war from 1918 to 1922, when the USSR is established as a nation, and we will proceed to ignore them. From 1922 until 1939, when the Nazis signed a non-aggression pact with the Russians that catches everybody by surprise. Is even Winston Churchill, who will say that the Soviet Union, the Russians, trying to understand, it was like trying to figure out a riddle, right inside of an enigma, inside of a mystery. And then the Great Depression happened. Economic collapse, not just economic, spectacular failure of communism, or rather capitalism. A spectacular failure of capitalism. And so people, understandably, think back to just a few years ago. Remember the Great Recession? Remember how people were losing their homes, life savings? It caused something of a minor revolution in this country. Because, one of the things from the Great Depression had been the Glass-Steagall Act, where Roosevelt signed into law, we do not want investment bankers and commercial bankers. That is, we don't want the people that play casino money with your money, merging with the kind of money that small business owners had to borrow from. Keep them separate. So this kind of thing, this collapse could not affect anybody anymore. But somewhere along the way, Glass-Steagall became merged again. That's how you got Citigroup, Travelers Group Insurance, and Citibank merged to produce Citigroup. And then in the early 2000s, Citigroup was one of the several banks, like AIG, got to be so big. They're so big in the economy, if they fail, they take everybody with them. Thus came the phrase, too big to fail. Then the government came to us, you. They said, listen, American people, we know that they swing you out. Certainly you lost your home because of them. You lost all your life savings, but they need your money again so you can save them and save the economy. Well, what about my life savings? Well, what about that? What about my home? What about that? So let me try to understand this. The people who caused this problem economically in the early 2000s, because they were corrupt and cheating, they wrecked the economy. Do I got that part right? Yes. And so now, because they didn't do their jobs, they did something that I would have been fired for. You're coming to me telling me that the money I've lost to them already, the life savings, the home, just set the economy on fire. You're telling me now you want my tax money to bail them out. Yes. And they're going to benefit, right? Probably. What about me? We can't help you. That's what people said. I have been taxed enough already. Do you remember the Tea Party? the minor revolution. I remember because I ran again that year. I'm still in therapy. But the Tea Party had a good reason. They were understandably upset, and people should have been upset. So roll that back a generation or so to the Great Depression. People were asking the same question. How did this happen? Who's responsible? Are they being held accountable? The answer is we found out what happened. We knew who was responsible, and no, they were not held accountable again. They never seemed to be held accountable, never. So when the Great Depression hit, people were desperate, afraid. I don't mean as in disturbed or annoyed, I mean afraid. If you've been a parent, you've heard children crying because they're hungry. Parents don't know to not be afraid when their children are frightened. That's part of being a parent. It's a good thing. So people were desperate. So every now and then, not all Americans, but enough Americans, in the 1930s, because of the economic crisis called the Depression, looked across the Atlantic Ocean to Eastern Europe, called the Soviet Union, and wondered, well, I wonder what that's like over there. Some of them took a bite of the apple and said, it's rotten also. It came back to the United States. And then on January 1933, FDR said, the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. Unreasonable, abject fear. The economy would eventually heal itself. The Depression would end. But during that period where you find a number of people who were kind of flirting with communism, going to communist meetings, the American Communist Party is promising all kinds of things because people were desperate and looking for alternatives because the failure of capitalism wasn't imaginary. It was real in front of them every day. So by 1948, 15 years later, brand new situation. We fought one war, another world war. The economy's been resurrected. It's a booming post-war economy. We're dealing with the other thing called inflation. But the House Un-American Activities Committee is investigating people who now have had communist links. Well, in the 1930s, would have been a lot of people that went to a communist meeting, more than likely, didn't become communists. But that hysteria is already running through in 1948. It's not being helped by the fact that the Russians are being very aggressive on the world stage. So the House Un-American Activities Committee kept on investigating people and hauling them before committees on Capitol Hill and beating them up, humiliating them and threatening them and intimidating them. And there's a funny thing about people who are being humiliated and intimidated by the federal government. Oftentimes they cave in to the pressure. Despite the fact there's a constitutional republic where their rights as citizens should be primary first, committee needs seconds, but they didn't.
In Washington, fear of communist subversive activities has developed into hysterical frenzy which grows daily. Appointed by Congress to investigate, Chairman Parnell Thomas opens the hearing.
Investigating alleged communist influence and infiltration in the moving picture industry must not be considered or interpreted as an attack on the industry itself.
The first of the screen stars to testify before the Committee on Un-American Activities is veteran actor Adolph Marshall. Once known as the screen's best-dressed man, he states,
The Communist Party in the United States should be outlawed by the Congress of the United States. It is not a political party. It's a conspiracy to take over our government by force, which would enslave the American people as the Soviet government, 14 members of the Politburo, hold the Russian people in abject slavery.
The court is packed with fashionably dressed women, as witness Robert Taylor takes the stand. In answer to a committee question on whether the Communist Party should be outlawed in America, Mr. Taylor replies,
I personally certainly do believe that the Communist Party should be outlawed. However, I'm not an expert on politics or of what the reaction would be. If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
The congressional investigation is not a judicial hearing, but refusal to testify results in a contempt of Congress charge. Next on the list of witnesses is Ronald Reagan, who says,
I will be frank with you that as a citizen, I would hesitate, or I would not like to see any political party outlawed on the basis of its political ideology, because we've spent 170 years in this country on the basis that democracy is strong enough to stand up and fight for itself against the inroads of any ideology, no matter how much we may disagree with it. But at the same time, I never, as a citizen, want to see our country become so, or become urged by either fear or resentment of this group that we ever compromise with any of our democratic principles through that fear or resentment.
But we agree
I
with
still
that,
think
too.
that democracy can do it.
We agree with that. We agree with that. Thank you very much, Ben.
the week ended with the cameras reporting yet Was in Washington.
Oh, yeah. I don't want to see our democratic principles being compromised by fear or intimidation.
Don't believe you have the right to ask a question of anybody.
It's very apparent that you're following same line of these other witnesses.
I am following no line.
Which is definitely the communist line.
I am using my own head, which I shall continue to
You're
do.
excused. And if you want to make a speech, go out here under one of the big trees and
Thank you.
sound off.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman,
The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
Then you
answer to
denied-
a question
then you-
which invades his, absolutely invades.
Then
his
you
right.
denied, you refused to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will
All right.
offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and
Here's the
everything
witness.
else
Here's the
to
witness.
the American public, and they will know where I stand, as they do from what I have written.
Stand away
I have
from the
written
stand.
for Americanism for many years, and I shall
Stand away from the stand.
fight for the Bill of Rights, which you
I'll
are trying to destroy.
stand away from the stand.
By the way, you all, 1945, 1946, 1947, 1948, because of the crisis of World War II and the refugee crisis that was precipitated by World War II, millions of people fled their homes in World War II seeking asylum. What I'm getting to is this. The asylum laws that were written post-World War II were written in response to the fact of the humanitarian crisis that arose after World War II. Millions of people fled, trying to just save their lives from the Nazi war machine, and they had no place to go because countries did not accept them. The case that stands out in my mind is the SS St. Louis that left Hamburg, Germany in 1939 with about 900 plus Jews on that ship. They came to New York City, were refused entry. They went to Miami and were refused entry. They went to Havana, and the dictator of Cuba was so worried about Adolf Hitler, they refused entry again. So they did what? Went back to Europe in 1939, where Adolf Hitler already had made plain his intentions. If you didn't know it in 1939, you surely had to know it on November 9th and 10th, 1938 with Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when Jewish synagogues, homes, and businesses were burned, bombed, and looted to the ground, and the German police and citizens looked the other way or sometimes participated. Frankly, it reminded me what happened in the South during Jim Crow, in many instances, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood, Florida, East St. Louis, 1916, Chicago, 1919. So the immigration laws that people are bellyaching about today, I get it. Those laws were put in place to deal with the humanitarian crisis, which, by the way, is underway again, because in 2011, there was a thing called the Arab Spring that broke out in Tunisia, that moved east across the Mediterranean, northern African states through Libya, that produced a civil war, and then finally to Egypt, that was suppressed by that government over there, and then finally to Syria. Bashar al-Assad, the son of Hafiz al-Assad, brutally crushed and attempted to get rid of him in the 1970s and 80s. He is a member of a group of people called the Alawites in Syria that have been ruling for decades, brutally. So they have to hold on to power, because if they ever lose power, that minority in Syria is going to be held to pay for them for being the group that's made life so miserable for so many other people who are just waiting for their moment. So Bashar al-Assad, the son of Hafiz al-Assad, has to hold on to power, just like Kim Jong-un has to hold on to power in North Korea. Think about this. Since 1946, North Korea's had 3 leaders: Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un, who, after all, also killed his uncle because he thought he might be trying to overthrow him. Now, when we bellyache about immigration, and I get it, it's a problem. It is unfixed. It has been left unfixed and made just completely, miserable by Democratic and Republican administrations that have failed to do their jobs. But there's also precedent around the world where people can lose their citizenship with the stroke of a pen. Again, 1935, the Nuremberg laws, where millions of German Jews had their citizenship stripped. They thought they were German Jews, and many of them were more German than Jewish. They were practicing cultural Jews, but not practicing Jews, identifying more as Germans. But you know what? They're being German, they're being Jewish, trump that. In 1948, while all that's happening in America, while suspicions of people are being hauled before the Congress, before different committees, and being asked, have you ever been a communist? While that's going on domestically, internationally, in Eastern Berlin, I failed to put a map up here showing that after World War II, Germany is divided into different sectors, the Soviet, American, French, British sector. Inside the Soviet sector, as per the Yalta Agreement, Berlin was taken by the Russians at the end of World War II and similarly divided between the British, the Americans, the French, and the Soviets. Inside the Soviet sector, since Berlin is inside of the Soviet sector of Germany, they cut off land access to West Berlin, intending to starve the people in the French, British, and American sectors, deprive them of fuel oil, food, medicine, whatever people need to live. So the Americans got together with the British and staged something called the Berlin Airlift. So for the next year or so, American and the British cargo planes were landing sometimes within seconds of each other, bringing fuel oil, bringing food, bringing medicine, bringing candy, bringing toys for children. I used to work with a woman back in Ohio, Kristen Ashby. She was just a child when this happened. She said that the American planes would fly over sometimes, and once they got low enough, the pilots would pull back the window, throw chocolate to the children. She thought the Americans were just great because of that. We're going to move on. That's in 1948. The Berlin Airlift finally ends in 1949 because Stalin did not see that coming. Stalin did not believe that the Americans would do this. And then when they started the airlift, they didn't think they could keep that sustained for a whole year. In 1949, the blockade was lifted, the airlift ended. But it showed, if nothing else showed people that the Grand Alliance to World War II had broken down, the fact that the Russians were willing to starve West Berliners into starvation, well, it proved who they were. A public relations nightmare for the Russians. Then in 1949, Mao Zedong kicked Chiang Kai-shek out the mainland onto Formosa, today you call it Taiwan. Then, in 1949, the Soviets exploded their first atomic device. This won't help anything. They get their nuclear secrets through a spy network from America, through Canada, to Russia. So, spying is real. Communism is real. They're on the move. The Greek crisis was real. The Truman Doctrine is in effect by 2 years now. So in 1949, the decision is made, since Eastern Europe is literally occupied by the Russians, for the North Atlantic nations to come together in a mutual cooperation defense pact. All right, going back to the Concert of Europe, 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, because Napoleon's France showed that a unipolar power that's got excessive power is affect everybody else. But to offset that is through collective security, which is what NATO is. 1949. So they come together. This will show you NATO's expansion over the years. Now, let me just pause right here. Turkey is significant for us today because of Incirlik Air Base. Turkey looks out on the Middle East, meaning Iran and Iraq, which also means Syria, Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon. Constant hotspots that show no sign of abating as far as their hostilities anytime soon. So Syria is, we need Turkey. Greece has been stabilized. It's now part of the family of NATO. So in 2004, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, joined. They share a contiguous border with Russia. The Russians claim they're being encircled. Well, maybe they are, maybe they're not. Then several more Balkan states join. So by 2020, former Soviet republics are joining NATO. Used to be part of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. This Cold War military alliance shows you the penetration of the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia was a combination of the Czechs, the Serbs, Croatians, other minority groups that was brought together under the leadership of one man, Joseph Broz, who was known as Marshal Tito. Never did join, never did become part of the Soviet orbit. He's communist, but he's got his own style of communism. So even though he did pay attention to Moscow, they didn't pull him on a chain. He went his own separate way. He became part of something called the non-aligned nations, which after all, as a non-aligned nation in the United Nations, he joined African nations that were also becoming independent in the 1950s and 1960s. That formed a voting bloc internationally against the United States and the West and NATO. Because when the decision came for America to support African independence movements, they took a look at Europe and figured out what's more important to us. Well, American foreign policy in Africa has been generally, what's the word? Atrocious. And so when the Americans have a decision to make about, do I lean on France to give up Mali, Mauritania, and Senegal? Do I lean on Britain to give up Kenya, Tanzania, and Ghana? If I lean on them, might that make them angry about what's happening in Europe? Will that compromise our defense in Europe? The decision was made to prioritize Europe over African independence, and African leaders noticed that and held a grudge for a while. It took it out on many votes in the UN, not aligning themselves in what's called the non-aligned nation states. So consider this. So NATO comes together in 1949. Can it last? What's happening today? I submit to you that before you start talking about NATO, you can't just talk about NATO anymore and be European centric. A few years ago, I was at a meeting of historians and they said, well, you know, Europe is passé. I said, in what universe does Europe not matter? In what universe? Tell me, come on. In what universe does Europe not matter? There's no universe, not on this planet. I can't tell you all how ironic it was that the only black guy in the room was advocating for Europe. That was new and different. So consider this. Remember how in the early 1990s, something called the Serbo-Croatian Wars broke out? That is the same area where World War I began. Okay, so Franz Ferdinand, Archduke, nephew of Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary is a conglomeration of independent or not independent, but different nationalities and religions. You have Muslims down there, Christians, Christian Catholics, Protestant Catholics, Muslims of different varieties and so forth. Everybody, different languages, different religious traditions. They all want to be independent, have their own culture, their own nation. The only thing they can agree upon is the fact that they squabble. And that's where World War I breaks out. That same area, the early 1990s, after World War I, World War II, they're still squabbling. And it broke out one more time to include concentration camps of Muslims during the Serbo-Croatian Wars of the early 1990s. And to add insult to injury, this is concentration camps in Europe after the Holocaust, after Rwanda, after the Armenian genocide. You would think that humanity would have learned this lesson by the 1990s, but no. Let's do it one more time.
The advanced party of Serb special forces move into Sokolac on the southern outskirts. They've taken hundreds of prisoners. The troops bayoneted the Bosnian government shield on a municipal building. And this young Muslim prisoner was forced to wear a fez. Some Serbs refer contemptuously to Bosnian Muslims as Turks. The siege is more than just another battle in a brutally intractable war. It's revealed rifts between the allies.
The Serbo-Croatian wars forced us to rethink several things. Like, if that's a Bosnian Muslim, well, then apparently not all of them are dressed in the Middle East and have olive or dark skin. Like Malcolm X found out when he made to Mecca, there are Muslims who look very much like white Americans. As a man of faith, he said, well, I said I'm a man of faith and all Muslims are my brothers. So that's his cut point. Either you do or don't believe what you say. It turns out that there being Islam, Muslim was more important to him than how they came packaged. But in the 1990s, Bill Clinton, as a president, deployed American forces under Admiral James Stavridis, who was a NATO commander, to that part of the world to conduct a bombing campaign that did stop the Serbians from attacking Croatians and eventually produce a ceasefire agreement in that part of the world, which settled things down for a moment. I say settle them down for a moment because real peace is not broken out yet. But then that brings us back to now. As Kit pointed out in her introduction, in 2022, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. The Ukrainians have more than enough reasons to distrust the Russians because under Joseph Stalin, millions of Ukrainian citizens lost their lives by attempting to resist the Soviet government. The eventual Russian leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was called the Butcher of Ukraine. He was sent there specifically to bring the Ukrainians into line. So the relationship between Ukraine and Russia has been strained, to say the least. But this latest invasion of Ukraine comes after their invading of the Crimea, before then Georgia. Joseph Stalin himself was a Georgian Russian who rose to power after Lenin died in 1924. So Georgian Russia, Ukrainian Russia, Crimean Russia, and Ukraine was set to join NATO as one of the many nations that have been joining NATO up until then. And so NATO is there with Article 5 being an attack upon one being an attack upon all. And given what happened recently, there are questions about whether or not the Ukrainians will be able to keep on fighting. They're a small nation with limited resources, and many people have asserted, I'll leave it to you to figure it out, maybe we can do this during the discussion. Many people have asserted the fact that American citizens are more than likely not going to be in favor of sending American troops, that is boots on the ground, in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Okay, so the next best option people said was to, well, let the Ukrainians fight their own war against the Russians, but they need the tools to do it. Does that make us complicit? Does that get us involved? Is it just an updated form of Lend-Lease, the thing that we did with Great Britain and Russia before we got involved in World War II, that is giving them the tools to fight the Nazis over there? Then the war came to us at Pearl Harbor, then we had no choice, it didn't matter after that. I mentioned Turkey. Turkey's position, Turkey was very important for us at 2003 with Operation Iraqi Freedom, because there are air bases, monitoring facilities, radar stations in Turkey that provide intel to American operations throughout the entire Middle East, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, Greece, Syria, still commanded or ruled by Bashar al-Assad, the son of Hafiz al-Assad, another nation where the family business is tyranny. And of course, to the east of Turkey is Iran, who we clearly want to keep an eye upon. They're trying to do what? Get themselves a nuclear weapon to join the nuclear club. I cannot think of anybody from the West who thinks that the Iranians getting a nuclear weapon is a good idea. If you look at the map of the Middle East, Turkey looks out on Iraq, Iran, which is a necessary thing to monitor them. Understand, the Iranian regime since 1979 has been exporting terrorism around the world. They are a clear and present danger to their region and to us globally. One way of keeping them in check, that is containing them, is through the resources of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because they have tremendous reach And it turns out they have plenty of people who are willing to do their bidding in the Soviet Union and also in Europe. They also are clear opponents or competitors in the region with Saudi Arabia, who clearly are, if not allies, or at least friendly enemies. And there's also Kuwait, the Persian Gulf, where American warships and Marines deploy on a regular basis for 6-month, 9-month floats, keeping a presence in the region just because it's a good idea to keep a presence in the region. Also look at Oman and Qatar, two nations where when you can't go talk anywhere else, Oman and Qatar are usually intermediary nations where we can go there and set up talks to reach agreement if you can't reach agreement. Plus there's also the United Arab Emirates, an economic power in the region. Dubai is in that area. And then further south, Yemen. I need to remind us that in 2000, in Yemen, when an American warship, the USS Cole, made port there, a terrorist vessel blew a hole in the side of the USS Cole. Then the next year, 2001, 9/11. If you connect the dots on the stuff working from 9/11 backwards, you will understand, you come to realize that people have been at war with us for about a decade or more, then we finally found out too. 9/11, clearly you cannot ignore that. But that's 2001. 2000, the USS Cole gets a hole blown into the side of it. In 1998, the embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and in Nairobi, Kenya get blown up within moments of each other. 2 American embassies in 2 different countries being blown up within moments of each other, that's not an accident. In 1996, Kobar Towers, the whole face of the barracks is blown off of where Air Force personnel are being staying. They're there as a holdover from what? Desert Storm. Keep an eye on Saddam Hussein in the region. That's 1996. In 1993, they tried to blow up the World Trade Center with a truck bomb in the basement. A decade earlier, they blew up the embassy in Lebanon and the airport where 234 Marines lost their lives. There are other things that happened in between all that, but you can connect the dots from 1983 to 2001 and say to yourself, how can we not see it coming? The answer is they knew. In action. It's a very refined information sharing network where the European powers have to trust us because they have people in the Middle East, they have people in Africa. In fact, things got so bad after 9/11, they even established something called Africa Command in Stuttgart, Germany. I'm still trying to figure that out. But Stuttgart at least has Africa Command in recognition of the fact that the African continent, yes, is part of this whole global network where NATO is a good clearinghouse to manage information, share it, disseminate it, and maintain peace, both obviously in Europe, but also in other regions of the world. This is something people don't think about a whole lot. Every year, the Defense Department puts out a climate adaptation report. Every year they do it. Now, as I said to you before, the political cartoonists, they always get it right. But you know what? I understand it. There'll say people that hear this and they go like, you know what? I just don't care. I don't care. Okay, well, that's one way of approaching it. But every year, the climate defense, the DoD Defense Climate Adaptation Plan, this year's, permit me to read this, it's from the forward, from this year's report. Climate change fundamentally alters the conditions that shape military operations at home and around the world. At the same time, climate change is reshaping our strategic interests. Understand, DoD, these are military officers, these are military people. They don't care what side of the aisle it's coming from. They're saying, look, we're DoD, our job is to fight the nation's wars. So for us to do that out there, we got to report to you, Congress, procurement, to give us the money to do that out there that you say you want us to do, and preferably when. Here's what's going on out there. So out there, things are changing. That's a Republican thing. No, that's not about that. No, it's not about Democrat, Republican. That things are happening out there. We fight out there. So out there, things are changing, requiring new tools, new technology. And if you want us to win the wars you say you want us to fight, understand that things are changing out there rapidly. As changes in the physical environment create the opportunity for well-prepared forces to secure a competitive advantage, deter aggression, and protect the United States and its interests, we leave a global footprint. We're a superpower. We are not inconspicuous. We cannot hide. We should not want to hide. We have something to offer the world on many levels. That comes with responsibilities as well. The Department of Defense must both understand and adapt to the ways in which extreme weather and climate change affect our readiness and capabilities. Over the past decade alone, extreme weather has significantly disrupted military readiness and driven tens of billions of dollars in damage and recovery costs across DoD. These extreme weather events, typical of those fueled by climate change, also impact training, testing, equipment availability, and infrastructure, and thus compromise DoD's ability to execute its mission. So if Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, can't train its Marines because of high tides, that means that you have a force whose lifeblood is readiness to go now. They can't do that. They can't do their jobs. Because training for warfare means training for it constantly, because you don't win wars by accident.
My name is Joe Bryan, and I'm the Senior Climate Advisor to the Secretary of Defense and the Department's Chief Sustainability Officer. We're frequently asked, what do climate change, sustainability, and clean energy have to do with the military's mission? Well, the short answer is a lot. Just look around. Climate change is dramatically impacting our world and creating new national security challenges. From hurricanes and wildfires impacting our bases, to drought and dislocation that fuel instability and conflict around the world. Climate change is creating new demands.
Okay, so let me address that last one he mentioned. For example, if there's a process going on on the African continent called increasing desertification, the Sahara Desert is getting bigger. It's already big. I mean, the first time I flew to Nairobi, we left Schiphol and we got over the Sahara. The pilot said, just look out your left window, you can see the Sahara Desert down there. So I looked down there, lots of sand, went to sleep. 2 hours later, woke up, looked at the window, still lots of, I said, we still flying over the Sahara? So we're at what, 28,000 feet at 700 miles an hour? So it's been so 1,400 miles later, still over the Sahara? Went back to sleep, woke up again, still lots of sand. So does this thing end? Or is this another desert? Still same desert, very big desert. And it's getting bigger. So on that continent, where foreign policy has either been atrocious or non-existent, on that continent, when people who are called pastoralists, cattle herders, goat herders, camel herders, can't find water for their animals, they're going to do what? They're going to try to find water. So very often they're going to try to find water that may be getting used by farmers. When farmers and pastoralists are doing what? Fighting over water, when they cannot resolve those crises over water, something which is as fundamental to human life as air, as molecules, as atoms, not a thing on earth calling itself alive can exist without water. So when they fight over that, it sometimes produces refugee crises or produces warfare, which produce refugee crises. And when people are refugees, that means they move from one area to another, and they take with them their what? Culture, language, and religion. If these are Muslims moving into a Christian area, or as in Central African Republic right now, Christians who are moving upon Muslims and causing a fight, it destabilizes the entire region of Central Africa, which also includes the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there just happens to be a mining operation going on there, where each and every last one of us who has one of these things, which means everybody, has a screen with a mineral that goes into these things. Every TV, computer, desktop, laptop, cell phone, iPhone in the world uses this particular mineral from China and Africa, which is incredibly important to our national defense and economy. So when people are moving like that and taking with them their different ideas about who they are and their cosmologies, it causes warfare. And sometimes to get away from warfare, they'll go to Northern Africa and then get on rafts and boats or whatever floats and float across the Mediterranean if they can to Southern Europe, causing a refugee crisis for Italy, Crete, Sicily, Malta. That's called Europe, where NATO is. Do you follow me?
More than 80%.
The global terrorism network. We have not heard about ISIS, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula for a long time now because, fortunately, we did a good job of stamping them out. But please, don't be naive. They have gone underground. Remember, prior to 9/11, Osama bin Laden and company they simply played the long game and bided their time. Think of it like this. Let me do a more conventional example. December 7, 1941, what could have been more perfect than catching a group of Americans still sleeping off their Thanksgiving dinners from a couple of weeks earlier on a Sunday morning at 7 o'clock in the morning on Sunday? Just getting up, Sunday, Christmas time, going to church sometime that day. Perfect time to do what? Hit them at Pearl Harbor. Everything lined up for a complete surprise, total annihilation of 2,400 American citizens. So terrorism around the world is not just isolated to the Middle East. As we know all too well, terrorism, to include the kind that happened in Columbus, Ohio just a couple of days ago, when Nazis marched through southern Columbus, Ohio. I'll try to make a point too. The mere fact that the KKK and Nazis are homegrown does not negate at all, does not make irrelevant the fact those are still terrorists as bad as Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, ISIS, anybody else, just homegrown. For example, in Nigeria, Boko Haram. You all remember the ones that kidnapped those 200 some odd girls from Nigeria a few years ago? Those girls still have not been found. Nigeria was a pretty much stable, had its problems, but northern Nigeria has been destabilized by these guys for a while now. Now, Nigeria happens to border Cameroon. Every now and then, the Cameroonians and Nigerians, they fight over the oil rivers that flow onto the Bight of Benin to an island called Malabo that most Americans don't know about, where it's nothing but an oil producing facility there. In the early 2000s, Nigeria was the 5th largest exporter of oil to this nation, which we still use and therefore need for strategic interests. African countries have available to them something called the African Union and ECOWAS, Economic Community of West Africa, but they simply don't have the air, land, and sea capability to defend the continent the way they say they want to. So they often have called upon the metropoles, London, Paris, Washington, or Brussels, to give them assistance to fighting the terrorists or the Islamic independence movements in the Sahel and Mali and Mauritania. They made life in Mali and Mauritania essentially stable countries now. They're up for grabs. Boko Haram is an ISIS wannabe, copycat.
During the first week of this year, Islamist militants captured an army base in Borno, Nigeria, and reportedly massacred hundreds of civilians in nearby towns. These satellite images show the aftermath of the violence. It was part of a string of escalating attacks by Boko Haram, the same group that kidnapped more than 270 high school students last year. The group dates back to 2001, but became much more violent starting in 2009. In the past few years, the attacks have grown increasingly frequent and brutal, threatening to destabilize Africa's most populous country. Boko Haram wants to replace Nigeria's democratic government with an extremist theocracy. Still, because they operate out of the northeastern states, most of their victims have been the poorer Muslim communities that live there. Broadly speaking, Nigeria's population is split between Christians, mostly in the south, and Muslims, mostly in the north. This dates back to British colonial rule, when distinct ethno-linguistic societies were stitched together to form Nigeria's current borders. Poverty, health, literacy, they're all worse in the north than the south, and the violence only contributes to the marginalization of the region.
NATO can be and has been a positive element in being able to keep eye on those developments in that region of the world. Let me say this again. Those kind of Islamist movements are not going away. When people are poor and desperate and angry, you can radicalize, especially a young population, quickly. They're looking for something to do. And young men with nothing to do, that's not a good thing to have. So they find something else to do. And then from this map, you see the Horn of Africa meaning like a rhinoceros horn on the right there in the east. We have Somalia, which is dealing with Al-Shabaab. Somalia, of course, is to the north of Kenya. Somalia has the port of Mogadishu. which is a natural deep water port. It was very valuable for the U.S. Navy to port there, but I don't know if it's of any use now after 1993 with the Battle of Mogadishu. You have read or heard about the movie or the book Black Hawk Down, where we went there, and it was pretty much a failed operation, except for the fact that we succeeded in this, that the principle of leave no man behind was held to by our Delta Force troops. We don't leave people behind. That's not our ethos in the military. We don't do that kind of thing. That's why it still hurts that 2,400 Americans are still somewhere languishing in Vietnam. Al-Shabaab, as you can see, are not a pro-democracy movement. Mogadishu is a deep water port to the north of Kenya, which has Mombasa, another good naval port. We fortunately had good relations with the Kenyan government. And to the east of both of those countries is the Indian Ocean, where the island of Diego Garcia is located, which has pre-positioned materials there that are staged and ready to go. So an American naval fleet goes there, picks up extra equipment, and deploys to the Middle East if they have to. That way they don't have to carry things with them. They can go there, pick it up, and continue on to destination for an area of the world where we're guaranteed to have conflict at some point. The NATO countries that have expanded into Eastern Europe, the traditional NATO allies, have shared intelligence. All these things happen because of shared intelligence and trust. And obviously, the relationship between them also, if it's going to come to Europe, defense as well. So much of what happens in the Middle East, so much of what we're able to do around the world is because of that relationship with NATO, and we share intelligence with them, they're sharing intelligence with us. Another thing many people don't think about, the global drug trafficking network. People worry about immigration from South America. Let me tell you something. The cartels have figured out that it's actually shorter distance and safer to fly from Brazil or the eastern part of South America to Africa, and then move their drugs up through Africa into Southern Europe, through Northern Europe, then back across the Atlantic to Canada and North America. You worried about opioids from China? You should be. You should also widen your lens. Now, as they're moving through Western Europe, what agency, what organization, what mutual defense agency might be helpful in stopping that trafficking? And look, this is not just about money, because the people moving the drugs, they don't use drugs. They are using those drugs, the drug money, to buy weapons, to fund terrorism. They are into destabilizing states, to include the United States and countries in Europe. So, the question that we should be asking is not so much what is the future of NATO, but NATO countries right now, I suspect they're asking themselves, why should I trust you, America? You change every 4 years. Your policy is impossible to follow. And oh yeah, by the way, United States, you just have chosen to elect leadership, which has promised on many occasions to dismantle us. So tell me one more time, America, why should I trust you? I'm waiting. I'm just asking questions here. You see, because your existential crisis is not mine. You're America, I'm Great Britain. You're America, I'm France. You're America, I'm Spain. This may surprise you, Washington, but my interests are actually in Barcelona, not Washington, or London, not Washington, or at least as much in London as Washington. So forgive me if I prioritize my British people over your people over there. So why should I trust you? Or are you telling me that you want me to do something like set up a different kind of international collective action, collective agreement of defense, and with you, like the British, who are now starting to reap the reward, the benefits, or so let's say the consequences of Brexit? They're being told you're no longer part of the European Union, so we would have done that with you. You were part of the EU, but that's not who you are right now. And by the way, remember, you wanted that. You all remember America First? Bring it to a close here. America First, remember that? America First, before World War II, all for America. Good idea. I'm all for America too. But, it turns out that we live in a neighborhood of nations. And America First was being touted, being embraced, being advertised with the rise of dictators in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and militarist Japan, they literally were stomping across the globe in China in 1931, in Italy in 1922, and in Germany in 1933 to 1933 to 1945. And people on this side of the Atlantic were talking about America first. It can't happen. It won't happen. People is promising Charles Lindbergh. Well, he's actually done some good things for the German people. What? And then they invaded Poland, September 1939. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And you know what? Just like you haven't heard anything for 15 days about rigged elections, voter fraud, broken systems, likewise, you also heard nothing the America First people after World War II started. You know why? Because they were something called wrong. America being first and looking on, looking at the lint hairs in his belly button had opened a way for the dictators who after all are opportunists. That's what they are. They're opportunists. They're like the playground bully. The playground bully goes around on the playground doing what? Looking to see who they can beat up. They stay away from the people they can't beat up. Why? Because they can't beat them up. Looking for opportunities. They found one. We stepped out. Vacuum. It was filled with dictators. There was 50 million people in Europe. We paid a price for that. In 1944, while the war was still being fought, Winston Churchill flew to Moscow without Roosevelt, without one of Roosevelt's representatives. In other words, Stalin and Churchill got together to map out a vision of Eastern Europe after World War II, because Churchill already knew that Great Britain would not be the colonial power that it was. Stalin was already grasping and looking to see what he could exploit under the cover of the war. And they both knew that they both could not trust America to be there doing its share after the war. So to head that off, Churchill said, let me get on the front side of this and salvage as much of our empire as I can. So he went there on October 9, 1944, and agreed to something called the Percentages Agreement. That is, telling Stalin, you have that in Eastern Europe, we'll take this over here. Churchill was trying to say what he can of his empire. It was scandalous.
There were other deals going on behind the scenes in this critical year. Mistrusting Roosevelt's optimism in Europe, Churchill flew to Moscow in October 1944 to meet alone with Stalin. Based on the previous experience of U.S. isolationism after the First World War, neither leader seriously believed that American troops would remain in Europe after the war. Therefore, it was vital to Churchill that he shore up the British position as strongly as possible. On the back of a scrap of paper, Churchill proposed the share of influence each nation would exert in post-war Europe. The USSR would get 90% in Romania, 75% in Hungary and Bulgaria. Yugoslavia would be split 50-50, but Britain would get 90% in Greece. Greece was vital to the British position in the Mediterranean, close to Egypt and the strategic Suez Canal, through which came the trade which kept the empire alive. From Eastern Africa through the Middle East, the Near East, and at the heart of this empire, there were other
So America's post-war influence in Europe was not lost at Casablanca or Tehran or Yalta, the wartime conferences. It was lost before the war. Before the war, when people saw Americans abdicating their role in the world, and Churchill said, we noticed, so did Stalin. And then they met to talk about, so we can't trust you. We can't trust you to look out for our interests. That's our job. That's what you communicated to us. So we're going to do just that. Because that's what unreliable partners get. So the question then is, given all those other concerns, see, NATO, of course, is about Europe, but NATO is also about the world, narco trafficking from South America, civil war in Africa, stability in the Middle East, information sharing, intelligence. And if you have people in major offices in this government that are either unqualified or hostile to national security and global security, who are making friends with dictators around the world, why should they trust us? Why should they trust us? I want them to, but I can't think of a reason right now, given what's going on, why they should. Why they should put their lives at risk based on what we said we're not going to do. And it's a democracy that spoke loud and clear 15 days ago. You shouldn't trust us. So, but just because people might deem us untrustworthy does not at all impact the fact that the price of liberty is still eternal vigilance. That's the conundrum. That's the contradiction. That still holds true. The question that I have is, have we been eternally vigilant? It's one thing to talk about democracy. Folks, it's time to do democracy now. How about that? Now you know how I keep my students all cheery and happy. Please, questions.
Steve, would you like to do the mic on that side? Or do you have a question right now? Oh, good. Excuse me.
Fred, in this morning's papers, it's reported that Ukraine has fired American missiles into Russia.
Long-range missiles.
Yes.
Yeah.
Putin now has responded by saying that the use of nuclear weapons is not out of the question. In your opinion, none of us has a crystal ball. In your opinion, how likely is that, or is Putin just bluffing? And if so, what kind of response would that provoke from NATO?
If the NATO countries hold firm to, again, not being a crystal ball, but if the NATO countries hold firm to their commitment, Steve, an attack upon one being an attack upon all has been the understood principle since 1946, 1949. And while one could never rule out, the likelihood of nuclear weapons, we also have to remember that Vladimir Putin is an international bully. And just like, what was it? No, going back to George Kennan. George Kennan in his long telegram said the following. He said, I know this much about the Russians. They understand force. They understand force and power. And they will exert it, they'll flex it, they'll use it, they'll threaten it, and they'll see how far they can get away with it until they realize that they can't. So to back down from them would be to validate the use of force. And the fact that they know that you're going to cave. So George Kennan, who actually during the post-war world did not agree with the way America conducted its foreign policy during most of the Cold War, he had disagreed with Vietnam, he disagreed with Korea. So George Kennan was not a war hawk, but George Kennan was a practical man when it stood force and power. So George Kennan said, meet force with containment. Don't fight them, but also don't give them a leg. So taking Kennan's advice, I would say, while no one's trying to, tempt nuclear war, at the same time, you have to understand a threat and intimidation. That's how you ended up this historical precedent for that called Hitler's bloodless victories. Before World War II, if you don't do X, Y, Z, I'm going to invade the Sudetenland. If you don't do X, Y, Z, I'm going to invade the Saar, the Ruhr, and different area in the Rhineland. If you don't do X, Y, Z, I may have to invade Czechoslovakia. So what happened instead? They gave them to him without firing a shot. They ended up going to war anyway, costing more lives, bloodless victories, giving him victory without shedding blood. So because he's trying to see just how far can I go before I finally had to fight you. So he fought them anyway. I'll say take Vladimir Putin at his word, the word of a liar, whose army, whose military has been severely degraded, but what he thought was a pushover power. And let's see. It's not a fun game. It's like playing the game of chicken. It's a dangerous game, but he's a dictator. And we need to remember this also. He's a dictator who was a secret police officer in the KGB in Eastern Europe when the Soviet Union was a world power. People would do well to remember that's his orientation. He remembers Russia as it was. He's trying to recapture those days. Times have changed, and so have we. We need to show him that we're the better nation. And show our allies we're the better nation too. Yes, please.
Article this morning talked about Russia as a result, I think, probably of the long-range missiles, has now determined to curtail exports of enriched uranium to the United States, which we don't have enriched capacity here in the US. So our nuclear power plants rely quite a bit on Russian uranium. So I think he's flexing his muscle a little bit right now in an article today.
Yeah. Well, I've had a lot of thoughts over the years about how America's, offshored its, defense production establishment to China and other places or Europe. Like if you've been in the air recently and ridden on an Airbus aircraft, Airbus is an international consortium. I think it's Spain, Great Britain, and France. They make good airplanes, but my question was why did Boeing set up production facilities? I think and share technology with China. Why would we do that? They're supposed to be an economic competitor, a military competitor. Why are we giving them some of our best technology? Because the Chinese have been known. I have a friend of mine who was a teacher in Finland who had a school in China. She said he just came in one day and just said, "This is ours." She went, "But I started this." They went, "Yeah, we know. Thank you for starting it." That's what they do. That's what they do because they have the Chinese government. They have the kind of power. So they are grasping. They believe in economic espionage. And if they're doing that to flex that muscle, what that says to me is we should be doing it here on this continent. Yes, sir.
Yeah. First of all, my understanding is that in some ways, our new president follows the Washington farewell address concept of that we will trade with Europe, but we will not be involved with any of their international conflicts. That being said, the way we handled the Crimea and the fact that we didn't really respond when that occurred is troubling to me. And I just want to know your thoughts as to what you feel might be the focus that our country may take in trying to resolve the war in the Ukraine.
You mentioned Washington's farewell. There's another part of the farewell after he talks about, not getting involved in, many people often correctly cite not getting involved in European entanglements, which is, I think, it's a paraphrasing, all right? The Europeans, Washington's saying like, look, the Europeans are slick, they are aggressive, they've been at this longer than we have, and they're just better at it, so don't get involved with them. But the part that always captured my attention was the part further down in the address where he said, a day will come where somebody on this continent, men of ambition and power who will say and do anything to gain power, and they will take the tools of government that have been designed to protect the Republican democracy and use those same tools, the guardrails and tools to protect it, and use it to dismantle it. He warns about that as well. How will the conflict in Ukraine be resolved? I don't know. How would I like to see it be resolved? I would like to see the Ukrainians achieve victory over Russia, not a ceasefire. Because as I mentioned to Steve, the Russians understand force. Vladimir Putin is from the Soviet Union's era where force was everything, and it still is. We know that force is still the same, that's still a major brand of Russian foreign policy because they forcibly invaded Georgia. They forcibly invaded Crimea. They forcibly invaded Ukraine. So what about that does not add up to imposing your will upon somebody? So if there's anything to a good defense being a good offense, stop their offense, check them. And giving back territory to a bully is not solving your problem. It's just communicating to the bully that what they did worked and further incentivizing them to do it again. Now, many people have argued that with Moldova, Montenegro, and other countries, Slovakia joining NATO and so forth, that they felt encircled. You can't feel encircled. You are not. I understand the Russians have a lot to be worried about. If you look back to World War II and World War I, okay, those were legitimate invasions, but in a brand new era, which this is, then they were using the Warsaw Pact as a buffer against invasion. The Cold War's ended now. We're supposed to be doing better. We weren't. So they're using Warsaw Pact encirclement as an excuse to invade other neighbors. Ironically enough, justifying the need for NATO. I want to see the Ukrainians have a total victory and get back Crimea. Now, I think I told you all before, I'm not a pacifist. I'm not. I believe in the use of force when necessary. And sorry, that's just a Marine Corps officer speaking to me. Yes. Yes, sir. And then up here.
Dr. Johnson, thank you for your historical discussions. They've been valuable for me. Interested in the future of NATO's power versus the growing power of the future of the Fortune 50 companies, its leaders, and its money.
That's a great question. Wow. You know, there's a student of mine, he's going to be graduating in the spring. He's getting commissioned as a Marine Corps officer. I asked him this morning, I said, Jake, so in the chow halls at Quantico, are the Marines still cooking the food? He went, no. I said, well, on the one hand, that's a good thing, because Marines are not known for their culinary expertise. But on the other hand, he said it's been outsourced to a company, to a food company, at my beloved Quantico Marine Base. So all that just to say that your reference to the Fortune 50 companies, we have the largest defense budget in the world, or a good, it's not a big percentage of our economy, but it's a lot of money, trillions of dollars. And there's money to be made from the Pentagon. And so I don't know how, if we undersource NATO to privatize warfare, we have a problem. Because privatization of warfare, to me, is kind of like in the same category as privatized prisons. Privatized prisons require people inside them to get a profit. Privatized warfare requires conflict, not peace. So therefore, there's money to be made from warfare, meaning mayhem, disease, crisis, human suffering, instead of doing things to bring resolution, conflict, and peace. So the goals of companies involved in warfare are directly contradictory to the goals of people who are trying to stop warfare from happening. They are. There's nothing wrong with making a profit. There's something wrong, I think, with making a profit by imprisoning people or waging war upon people. So I know that the NATO countries have been slow in contributing to their own defense budgets. We've been carrying it for a long time. There's one way of fixing that, make them start doing it. Once they start contributing their fair share per their own GDPs, then we come together and make that a tighter organization. That's the only way that's the only way forward that I can see to de-weaponize the charge that the NATO countries are not doing enough. If they start doing enough, then we can start looking at a more productive relationship, not just in Europe, but around the world, I think. But I don't see how the goals of Fortune 50 companies are going to mesh very well with keeping the peace. Yes, ma'am.
I don't think we can forget the cyber world,
Not at all.
because that's everywhere. And everywhere one carries them in their hand. No less.
Well, you've heard me mention about sharing intelligence, right? So the airstrike that you hear about that takes out somebody, that allowed the Israelis to destroy a nuclear facility in Iran. They're flying across different airspaces. So some people have to shut down radars or do jamming or whatnot. It has to come from different places. No, you're right. We live in a world where some operator in New Mexico is flying a drone over the Middle East that launches a Hellfire missile that destroys a local terrorist. He's in New Mexico. And that requires intelligence and sharing, NSA, CIA, all the four different organizations of the military, not to mention all the different variations inside of Europe. That requires trust. That requires human, H-U-M-I-N-T, human intelligence, and then the cyber intelligence as well. It used to be, when I was on active duty, it's called C3I, command, control, communication, intel, C3I. Now it's called command, control, communications, intelligence, and cyber. So C4I, command, control, communications, cyber, intelligence. So before any military operation goes, as Sun Tzu would say, before you take the battlefield, you should know all you can about your opponent, so that by the time you take the battlefield, you know more about what you're going to do than they do. You should know them that well, but you can't do that if your allies don't trust you. So therefore, if I can just say this, whoever you have as the person who's going to be your director of national intelligence has got to be somebody who's unimpeachable, that our allies can trust, who's not been making nice with foreign dictators, who clearly have no interest in democracy. I told you all on a number of occasions that, given the urgency of what's going on right now, I don't care what your race is, class, orientation. None of that matters if you don't have a democracy to talk about it and argue about it. At a minimum, to argue your cause, you need the context of democracy to argue and debate. No democracy, no debate. So the first priority for us right now, I think, is to preserve, protect, and defend and perpetuate democracy. In my humble opinion.
Thank you for another
others?
thought-provoking discussion, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you. You know what? You all, I gotta take an aspirin now. It's good being with you all again. See you next time. Yes. What now? I got about 5 minutes. I gotta get up to the, I'm teaching a class